Okay, we're on to our final talk of the World of the Worm, the Worms of the World virtual event. And this time we will be looking at earthworms in North America, but that's not earthworms from North America. It's about earthworm invasion that's occurring on the North American continent. And I'm delighted to welcome Professor Katalin Szlávecz with us, and she works for the Department of Earth and Planetary Science at Johns Hopkins University. Her research focus is soil biodiversity, earthworm ecology, and soil ecosystem services, looking at human-modified landscapes, including secondary forests, crop fields, and the urban landscape. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Katalin, and I really look forward to your talk. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to this event. And obviously, I've been studying earthworm for some time, but in my earlier career, I studied arthropods. So I started to study earthworms about 20 years ago or so. And obviously, fieldwork cannot be done without the help or contribution of a lot of people, students, collaborators, colleagues, technicians, and so on. I would like to just highlight two people that are the real earthworm experts. I'm a soil ecologist, and I learned a lot of the things, most of the things about earthworms from them. One of them is Csaba Csúszdy, who is an earthworm taxonomist in Hungary. And the other one is Chihan Cheng, who was my graduate student. And currently he's on faculty in Taipei University in Taiwan. So a lot of the things that you will see has been done in collaboration with them, or forms the basis of Chihan's thesis. So these are the topics I will cover, starting with just generally talking about soil biodiversity. I always do that, even when I'm asked to talk about earthworms, because I realized that a lot of people are not aware of the enormous diversity, the fascinating variety of life forms below ground. For obvious reasons, many of them are small, they are cryptic organisms, but also the fact that they are providing certain functions or performing functions that no other organisms can. And these functions are fundamentally important for us as well as for the ecosystems itself. And these include obviously decomposition, nutrient cycling, making nutrients available for the plants, but they need changing the structure of the soil. We just heard about that. And generally, they are a major component, a major driver in soil development. So going back to earthworms, I will refer back a little bit some of the things that Sam James was talking about in his first talk. So there are native earthworms in North America. And as James said, you can relatively easily find new species to science. And that's because they're very understudied. A lot of the groups are in great need of taxonomical revision, and they just haven't been properly described. And just to indicate how easy, so to speak, to describe them, these are two species that we found in close proximity where I live. And he mentioned this, the Diplocardia, it's a native genus in North America. The other one is in the family Acanthrodilidae, and this Bimastus is a genus in the family Numbricidae. And so we don't know who they are, many species, where they are, but we know even less about their ecology or just basic natural history. So definitely there's a great knowledge gap in understanding native earthworm ecology. So we know a lot more about the non-native earthworms, that these studies have been better funded, obviously, and that's partially because their presence is very visible. And I'm going to talk about two groups, essentially, the European and the Asian non-native species. I just want to mention that not all of them are invasive. So introduced or non-native and invasive, cover slightly different terms, although invasion is the term that, catches the attention, obviously. So I'm going to talk first what we call the first wave of earthworm invasion and the ecological effect of these group of earthworms. That's, like I said, much better known than the second wave of earthworm invasion, which I'll talk later. So the first wave of earthworm invasion concerns this family Lumbricidae that we heard several times. And what it is essentially transporting non-native species over from Europe to North America. And they are all in the group what we call peregrine earthworms. There are about 80 peregrine earthworms maybe, and these are earthworm species that live very well in human proximity. They travel well, and so we find them not just in North America, but in a lot of other continents as well. So how do they get here? Earthworms move with soil when it comes to crossing geographical barriers. And in this case, this introduction is very likely has been going on since European colonization. The immigrants brought them in their plants, in their potted plants that they want to bring over. There's always transport of potted plants or tree seedlings or saplings from nurseries or plant exchanges in botanical gardens or greenhouses. So that's another way of moving, not just earthworms, but other things around. In terms of volume, probably the biggest effect was moving soil or using soil as ship ballast. In the early colonial times, the ships came empty from Europe to North America, bringing back the goodies. And so the ballast material that was used back then was soil and not water as we use it today. And that soil need to be shoveled, as you can see here in this picture, to the shore. There were rules and regulations that they had to do that because obviously you could not dump it into the harbor areas because otherwise they would have filled the harbor up. So that's the part of, transport, so crossing these geographical barriers. The other part is, of course, sort of the colonization, establishment, and then the subsequent spread. And so two processes which were fundamental that at least contributed to their success in the North American continent. One is relates to geological history. This cartoon shows the glacial boundary during the last ice age. So everything above this was glaciated, obviously killed everything. And then when the during the glacial retreat, species were moving back, and the subsequent climate change species were moving back on north. Earthworms are extremely slow dispersers, and actually Sam James was calculating, they can move, X number of meters per year, which is not a whole lot. And so what we find, and people ask us almost always, or anybody who studies non-native species, how do you know if it's native or not? So what we find in North America is that the native species, such as this one, Eisenoides lundbergi, we also mentioned this as a wetland species living in a wide pH range, but it also lives in the forest that I study. So native species do not occur north of these glacial lines. They just simply, if they live there, they were not able to move back. Whereas if you look at, both of them are in the same family Lumbricidae, look at an introduced species, or actually this is a combination of distribution map for two species, you see that it's much wider. So they really are colonizing these areas north of this glacial line. And also they have these disjunct distribution, which indicates independent repeated introductions, both on the East Coast and on the West Coast. The other historical event relates to human history, and it relates to the massive land use change, specifically deforestation that took place after European colonization. As you can see, the peak of it was probably the turn of the 19th to 20th century. And so that these forests were cleared for timber, but also converted to agricultural fields. And even though later on many of these areas got reforested, the underlying soil, the underlying conditions with the earthworms in them were not converted back to the pre-colonial times. So I just want to mention that not everything came from Europe. So there are species within the native group, a native North American group, which actually made its way to other continents, such as Bimastus parvus. You find them in Asia and other places as well. And I just want to point out the attention to this group of green subspecies, Dendrodilus rubidus, which was thought to be one of these European introduction, one of these peregrine species, but molecular analysis shows that it's actually much more closely related to the Native American Lumbricidae than to these other species, which was mentioned earlier. So what we think is probably endemic to North America, got introduced to Europe and other continents subsequently. Excuse me. So zooming in a little bit to the area where I live, this is the Mid-Atlantic region. This is what we call. It is Chesapeake Bay, Washington, D.C., and Baltimore, where I live. Again, just illustrating the massive land use change, how essentially there were no forests, everything was used as cropland. And over time, these forests were coming back with agriculture abandonment, but also the urban areas, suburban areas, land conversion increased. And so again, this can be seen, this effect, this legacy of really long-term agriculture, we can actually find in the soil system, in the below ground system. This is the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, where I do a lot of my research. This is the Chesapeake Bay here, and these seemingly intact wildernessy forests are actually secondary forests regenerated from agriculture and different types of life history. And as you can see in this forest, we find native species, not too many, mostly dominated by these European Lumbricidae. And more recently, we didn't find them in 15 years ago, but more recently, this other group of Asian non-native species started to show up. I'll talk about this a little later. So the site history of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center is fairly known. So as we were trying to reconstruct this and looking at the soils of these different site histories, we can see that, for instance, some forest patches, which was never clear cut and has no earthworm. This is how the soil profile look like. Whereas in some other areas, which has very high abundance of non-native earthworms and also have a very long history of agricultural practices, the soil profile looks very different. So I'll talk about this a little bit in more details. So yeah, so are earthworms good? I mean, we think they are good. We like them. We want them into our backyards. And in fact, there are anecdotes, I wouldn't say evidence, that the Dutch people brought them over purposefully to what's now Manhattan, because this was north of this glacial line, there were no earthworms, and they wanted to have them in their gardens, knowing all the good things that earthworms do and all the benefits that they can provide to us. But in areas and ecosystems which has no evolutionary history with the earthworms, their effects is very profound, very significant, and depending on whom you talk to, it's not necessarily beneficial. For instance, in our forest, we found that these native orchids don't do very well in those forested patches where you have a lot of earthworms, and that's because they transport down the seeds of these orchids, which then cannot find the fungi that they need to germinate. And there are lots of evidence for that, especially for the more northern parts of states in the US. We do know earthworms eat a lot of leaf litter. So in our forest, when you have abundant earthworms, within a year, everything gets eaten. If you have forested patches with no earthworms, half of the leaf litter remains still on the forest floor. And then these Lumbricidae have very profound effect on carbon transport, carbon distribution in the soil. So if you have forest, like these ones with no earthworms, most of the carbon is on the surface. And then as you go down, you see this mineral soil with not much carbon. Whereas what earthworms do, mixing up, taking this carbon, bringing it down, mixing it up with the mineral soil. So then you have a more even distribution of carbon. So if you have more earthworms, you have less leaf litter. If you have more earthworm, less organic matter on the surface. And this is what tends to surprise most people. The soil tends to be denser, more compacted if you have more earthworms. And that's because this topsoil layer, this organic layer or duff layer, we call them, is very loose. And so as they're eating it, they're mixing it up with mineral soil, they are sort of making the soil denser than it was before. People have also shown that because this duff layer is an important resource and habitat for a number of different taxa. Most of them are smaller. So springtails and mites and nematodes and other, obviously, there's lots of fungal biomass here. As the earthworms are feeding off of this layer and mixing it up, these taxa that depend on this layer for food or habitat will disappear as well. So again, whether they're good or bad really depends on your preferences and your references in reference to what. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the second wave of earthworm invasion, and that is focusing on another family that also mentioned by Sam James, the Megascolecidae. And so these organisms that we call Pheretimoids also, I'll get to this in a second. So Megascolecidae were introduced from Asia to North America and other continents as well. It's a much later introduction historically, and as of today, at least, is a much bigger concern for conservation biologists and foresters and so on. So we call them often Pheretimoids, which is sort of just an umbrella term for 12 genera within this family, having about 1,000 described species. And again, they are largely unknown, even in their native habitat. They have been successful, or a subset of them has been successfully introduced in Europe, in all of the continents, really, minus Antarctica. And in some cases, they live in extreme habitats, such as near to volcanic calderas with high temperature, toxic fumes, high CO2 concentrations. In the US, so far, we have 16 species. Probably this number is higher now. And the common name, the most common that is you see in the media is jumping worms, but they have other names as well. And they got this name snakeworms. They move very differently from the usual Lumbricidae that we see in our gardens. So they really have this snake-like motion. And not all, but some species, when they are disturbed, they have this thrashing motion to trying to escape essentially being caught. And by the way, they do drop their tails, at least the ones that I have seen around here. They can be very large. So this is 15 centimeters, and I'll get to this in a second. Not all of them jump, like this very bright green ones. Well, we just talked about green colors, and this also lives in it's riparian zone, a very wet environment. People think, again, that's just anecdote, they might have been introduced with the cherry trees after the Second World War that the Japanese government donated to the US government. So one of the big difficulties to study them is that they're very hard to identify, unlike the very common Lumbricidae that you all are very familiar with. And that's because many of them parthenogenetic, which means that they just clone themselves. They produce cocoons without mating with another organism. Most earthworms are hermaphrodites. as you probably know. And because of that, the male organs, which are important characteristic, taxonomical characteristics, have been degraded. We don't see them. And so therefore, it's not as easy to find things like the male pore or some other organs to know what species we're looking at. And so that is one reason why a lot of the reports about their occurrence or existence comes just as jumping worms or just as a family level. So we actually did a little bit of a key that helping this to some extent, or hopefully. So out of these 16 species that I mentioned, 3 are of particular concern. And they are among the really larger ones. All 3 of them are native to Japan. And as you can see here, they are very common, all of them. And by commonness, I mean you can find them everywhere. But they're not common in a sense that they would dominate. You know, they're not abundant. They don't invade forests. In the forest, other types of Megascolecidae live. So these are just everywhere, but not in large number. Unlike here, where once they establish themselves, they can really reproduce fast and large and reach large densities and biomasses. And again, there's probably more dots now than when we compile this, the map, but again, these empty spaces just means they haven't been found, but probably are there or will be there very soon. Okay, one of the interesting things about them, they seem to be co-occurring. So these 3 species, at least 2 of them, everywhere we find them, we find at least 2, very often 3, and we don't know why this might be the case. So one thing that helps to, distinguish among them is cocoon size. So I think Sam again talked about cocoons, which are these very hardy structures that eventually the new juveniles will hatch from. These cocoons survive, wide ranges of temperatures, and this is a bigger species of the 2, has bigger cocoons, but as you can see, both of them are tiny. So to know what lives there, you would have to sieve a lot of soil. So another unique feature, or not unique really, but distinguishing from the European earthworms, is they are annuals. So they actually survive here in the winter months as cocoons. We start seeing them mid to late April, and they're very small at the time, and they start to grow, and then they mature to adults, and they deposit lots of cocoons. They're still growing. By fall, October, they're really big and they die. And then the whole cycle starts over again. So what we know about them, that they are voracious feeders, just like these big European earthworms. And however, unlike the European, which I showed you, does a lot of mixing and bringing down carbon to deeper layer, bringing up mineral soil, these tend to live very close to the surface or only in the leaf litter layer. And their cast is a very loosely structured granular mass, which then can be several centimeters high. So for instance, in this forest, which only has the Asian earthworms, this is the cast, the layer of the cast, and this is pure mineral soil. They don't go deep. And that's a concern. That's one of the concerns, many concerns, is because this is very loose stuff on the soil surface, which can be easily washed out by a runoff. And we see large amounts of earthworm cast along stream sides. So other than that, we really don't know a lot about their ecology and do not understand their success really in terms of invasion. So for instance, we talked about, okay, so earthworms can easily invade to an area which has no earthworms, which means they have no competitors and nothing. But at the same time, these European earthworms already established themselves. I always say they have a green card or something like that. And then this new wave of earthworm invasion is happening. So we don't know what the outcome of that might be. Can they coexist? One will drive out the other. There are some laboratory evidence, but not field data that they might be able to outcompete the European earthworms. We don't know what makes them really successful. There are some places we know they live in greenhouses only, but they, so far at least, they haven't been able to escape those. We see sometimes what we call boom and bust population cycles. So suddenly they arrive, there's a lot of them, and then the subsequent years, the population collapses and they never come back. And also, it's an interesting question. We do know that there are some morphological differences. These tend to be larger than the ones in Japan, and there are some genetic differences. But other than that, we don't know anything of their natural history or ecology, or any comparative work has not been done. What we do know is they are a big concern. So there are lots and lots of media, they get lots of media attention, pamphlets are going out, and in some states they consider to be species of concern or pests. And in fact, they are things in legislation, put in legislation in some states, such as California, Wisconsin, where they are prohibited to transport these species from one state to the other. As Sam was saying, even managing is difficult. Driving them to extinction, eradication, I think it's next to impossible. Even management of the population, all we can do is kind of educate people and then slowing down this process as much as possible. And so with that, thank you. These are two papers. One is a review paper looking at the status of these species, and this other one is sort of some methods to study them. Thank you.